Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for the second of our CPD sessions in Modern Foreign Languages. We are delighted to welcome back the absolutely brilliant William Law of Tunbridge School. He is our MFL setter, and I'm sure you will know that if you've been to one of his sessions before, you are in for a treat. He's brilliant. The aim of this session is to support you in delivering the second year of teaching the new MFL specifications for CE. So this webinar comes as a sequel to our previous Twilight CPD session on MFL in March, in which we discussed developing grammar and vocabulary skills and integrating EDI into teaching MFL at common entrance. I hope you enjoyed this session with William, and let me remind you to find us on social media at ISEB Awards on all channels. Now, once this session has finished, there will be time for questions. So, as previously, please use the chat function in YouTube to submit those to the live stream. Now, you might not see the chat function if you aren't logged into Google. So either log into Google or log into YouTube, one or other. If you still can't see it, it might be that you don't have a login. And so perhaps if you would like to and you're comfortable, create one, because that's going to open you up to the chat function so that you can ask me and Will any questions you might have. Sophie is going to collate those for you. She's standing by waiting to hear everything that you have to say, and we will try and make sure we answer absolutely everything at the end. So without much further ado, let me hand you over to William.
Hello, thank you so much, Julia. Good evening to all of you watching. It's wonderful to be back for the second in this series of Twilight CPD sessions for modern languages at 13 plus for ISEB. You might remember, if you joined us last time, that I was sort of inadvertently co-presenting with a Dachshund. Rest assured she won't be making an appearance tonight. She's been silenced and is locked away downstairs this time. So just me, I'm afraid. I hope that's not too boring. But here we go. The order of today basically is lessons for year 2, preparation for the second year of teaching the new ISEB 13 plus Modern Languages Specification. And we hope, as Judith just said, that this will be a useful complement, actually, not only to the recent session that we did on EDI and embedding skills in learners, really important issues for our subject, but also actually to the initial CPD that we ran over a year ago now. It seems sort of both more recent and much longer ago, on sort of introducing these new specs and talking about the nature of the assessment and the skills involved in the subject. So if we can sort of go to the first slide, please, where there's just a breakdown of what we're going to cover in this session. Yeah, the next slide with just, there we go, some pointers here. Fantastic. So there are 5 things really that I want to cover with you today. Approaches to curriculum design, because we're talking specifically about transitioning into the second year of teaching this spec and learning lessons from the first year of teaching it. We're also going to be talking about teaching, embedding and consolidating skills. Just a little refresher, really, coming back to some of the key messages from last session. And then preparing for the exam, extension and enrichment. And then finally, as always, we've created time for your questions at the end of the session, both those that have been submitted in advance. Thank you very much for doing so if you have, and also any that might occur to you as you watch here live. And just a reminder, as always, we are always really happy outside of these formal official sessions to answer any queries that you might have. Please do just get in touch with us. Just a couple of sort of housekeeping things really to begin with. It's the case that, as with previous sessions that I've done, we're going to discuss languages in general, and almost everything that I say is going to be relevant for the 3 European languages for which we offer qualifications, so French, German and Spanish. I'm not today going to be making too many distinctions between level 1 and level 2. And there might actually even, particularly as we turn to talk about skills, as we turn to talk about exam preparation and enrichment and extension towards the end, there might even be some items of some relevance to our case or academic scholarship papers in French too. So without further ado, let's get started. The first thing that I thought I'd talk about, given the brief that I was given today, which was preparation for the second year of teaching, is approaches to curriculum design. And I'd like to approach that idea of second year of teaching from two different but hopefully complementary angles. On the one hand, looking at what is specifically and literally the second year of teaching in a 2-year course, i.e. what I'm going to refer to essentially as year 8 throughout this session. And then on the other hand, considering some of the lessons learned and ideas to be taken from the first year of teaching and how these might impact on your teaching and assessment of learners in general at any stage, including, of course, how pre-year 7 even, you might anticipate aspects of the grammatical or skill or topic demand that the CE specifications place on their learners. And therefore, I thought a good way into this whole discussion might be to consider some of what seem like the very broad questions that you have on the screen in front of you now, namely, what is a curriculum for, thinking about both academic and practical considerations. I've just been distracted by Julia's messages in the chat there. She's not coming back, I'm afraid. She's monolingual, alas. But also thinking about what principles should underpin a good scheme of work, and also how assessments and exams, internal within your schools, and also public. And by public here, whilst I'm aware that it's more and more the case that prep schools are assessing their own common entrance papers, but public exams, i.e. terminal common entrance exams, are factored in, how those assessments work. It's at times like this that I kind of wish these sessions were fully interactive, because I'm sure there'd be absolutely loads that we could explore together here in a sort of seminar type context. But I thought at the very least I'd share some of my ideas with you, and perhaps you can let me know whether you agree or disagree a little bit later on. So firstly, as we think about what a curriculum is for, we just jump to the next slide, please, if that's okay. Thank you very much. As we think in general about what a curriculum is for, I think we do well to remember that a good curriculum is defined by its academic ambition and rigor, and by how effectively and practically it can be implemented. I think I recall saying last year in the sort of first of this series of webinars that there was no need to go away and tear up your old schemes of work and start again from scratch as you approach these new specifications. And just to reassure you, I maintain that view today. I'm not suddenly coming in here now and proposing something completely different. Equally, it's really important, not least in such a fast-moving subject as ours, to constantly reflect on what we do as well and think about how we can improve it, change it, and indeed think about how the ways in which our students currently and in the future are likely to use language should impact upon what we're teaching and consequently what we're assessing. So at its core, a curriculum is a way of explaining your subject to and helping your students to explore your subject. It's important that it allows students to make progression. That's absolutely critical. So thought needs to be given to sequencing within individual groups of lessons and across units or modules, and perhaps even across entire terms or even years. And I think this is a particularly important thing to think about today as we're reflecting on moving between years of teaching these qualifications. As you know as well as I do, this is particularly complicated in languages, and we're going to touch on some of the specificities of this in a little bit more detail later. I think a curriculum is also about ensuring consistency between classes and across a department too. Though that's not to say for one moment there isn't room for a differentiated curriculum, or, for example, a top set in our context here, following a dual common entrance scholarship program to follow a different scheme of work than a lower set. Moving on one step, the way, as you know, in which a curriculum is expressed on an individual school level is through a scheme of work. Creating a robust and versatile scheme of work is, in my opinion, one of the very most important jobs as a head of department. And it doesn't need to be an onerous one. In fact, it should be an interesting and challenging and stimulating task, because creating a scheme of work really gets to the heart of teaching and learning. It's about putting ideas and themes as expressed in a specification into everyday practice and thinking about how we might present those things. If I could just jump forward one slide, sorry, please. Thank you very much. Your scheme of work, it's ethos, its values, its content need to be understood by everyone in your department. In my schemes of work, for example, as well as specific objectives and key resources for each module or unit, I include some teaching notes, so musts in terms of a way in which a topic needs to be presented, or perhaps recommended approaches, as well as opportunities for cross-curricular links, including pastoral education or PSHE. And at the start as well, a general mission statement for that particular year group or class or course that also breaks down how we as a faculty over the course of the year intend to assess particular skills and evidence particular outcomes. Ideally, this is a collaborative document. In my department, in fact, it's one that can be edited live by anyone who teaches the course, but not just at the point of reception, also at the point of creation. It should be created ideally by triangulating understanding of the syllabus in question and its assessment requirements, knowledge of your own school and its students, and also best practice from your own experience too. And note how only one of these is directly related to the specificities of the particular spec in question. I think it's really important to put a premium on what you know works well for you as the teacher, and of course your students as well. And a scheme of work also needs to be reactive and responsive because there are so many variables. The profiles and characteristics of the classes you teach will change year on year, but so will things like lesson times. This year, for example, I taught 2 year 13 classes, one of whom I saw in a period that was often hit by sports fixtures. And it was amazing to see how quickly, despite being of roughly similar levels, a gap between these 2 classes emerged in terms of the speed and pace at which the content could be covered. And it's easy to fall into the trap of putting together a relatively abstract document, perhaps in the long summer holiday or during a break, when you can be quick to forget just how long a particular grammar point or skill takes to teach, or indeed to be ambitious or optimistic about how quickly you might complete something. This is particularly important, as we know, in languages where there are just so many different skills to juggle. And even on my own part, despite really good planning and a rigorous and centralized scheme of work, it never ceases to amaze me how often I'll realize that, oh, I haven't done any translation with this group for a couple of lessons, or gosh, a whole week's gone by and we haven't done any listening, for example. So I think one of the traps to avoid when creating a good scheme of work, particularly at this level, is to stuff it completely full, leave at least some breathing room in there. That's particularly important, as we'll come on to see later, in what I'm calling year 8, where as you approach the exam, of course, you want to leave enough time for any recurring issues to be addressed, and to leave proper time for practice, consolidation, and space for the students' own questions to be addressed too. Now, when I'm explaining the particularities of language teaching to colleagues with experience in other subjects, sometimes trying to justify a particular timetable allocation or need for a particular resource, one of the things that always strikes me and surprises them is that progression in languages rarely looks like progression in almost any other subject. It's unlikely, for example, that you'll teach a biologist or geographer in year 6 or 7 who could genuinely rival, say, an A-level student. But in languages, it's possible, not least because home language profiles can be diverse. But even taking native or bilingual speakers out of the equation, and in my experience, I quite frequently come across high-performing students in year 7 or 8 who could give some of our, say, lower-performing GCSE students a run for their money. And therefore, differentiation is especially important and doubly difficult in languages. One of the key messages from our first CPD session last year was do less, but do it well. So when I talk about differentiation, I'm not suggesting something as variant or disparate as, setting the year 8 top stream off on the passé simple or Molière, whatever it might be, whilst the bottom stream struggle with être un avoir. But do be prepared to go deeper with your naturally stronger students and exploit cultural opportunities as fully as possible. As we'll say shortly, and with some examples, year 8 in many respects is the perfect time to do this, despite the exam just being around the corner. Equally, at the same time, make sure that your naturally weaker students don't miss out on cultural input, which perhaps almost more importantly for them, gives this subject part of its raison d'être. As we all know too, in languages, it's not just the case that you can teach one unit and then move on to the next, perhaps with a nice summative test. One of the things that fundamentally I find really frustrating about our subject, it's also a reason to really enjoy teaching it and love it, is that actually you rarely see students performing at their very, very, very best until the end, because repeated exposure to language receptively, development of skills takes time. In a way, I sort of really envy those subjects who can teach a unit, use a past paper question, and then move on to something else and tie together all of those nice threads at the end. In language, it can seem sometimes like a real uphill struggle, can't it? As you end up coming back to things that you thought you'd secured, knowledge that you thought you consolidated, and then in fact you find 3 or 4 months later down the line needs to be revisited. And we'll give some thought to how we juggle those things shortly. Ours, in a sense, is languages is the ultimate sort of synoptic subject, and a languages curriculum, therefore, ideally should be spiraled within and between topics or grammar units, so that students constantly re-encounter, practice, and consolidate material, both in the short and in the medium and in the long term. At the same time, balancing this with an element of novelty and continued discovery is important. You don't obviously want to end up covering the same topics over and over again with just a few more items of vocab each time. But you might consider, or you might like to consider, how a topic such as, say, my town or the area where I live can be represented in different ways over a number of years. Initially, for example, when the topic is introduced, perhaps in year 5 or 6, with simple vocab for shops, directions, some transactional conversation practice, etc. Subsequently, perhaps in, say, year 7, with more of a subjective, creative slant. So perhaps getting students to create or discuss, what their dream town would be, what their nightmare town would be, a town with lots of cinemas or with no bakeries, or, where everything was very far away from everything else. And then finally, perhaps in year 8, with perhaps a depth study of a particular town or city in this example, with an explicit cultural focus. Something like, for example, Paris's hosting of the Olympic Games in 2024. Using some authentic materials, brochures, videos, etc. A couple of final reflections just on the scheme of work itself on a more practical level. 2 sort of different ideas. Firstly, something I often think about when I update or edit or refresh my own schemes of work is how, let's call it, crisis versatile they are. That's to say, if, God forbid, a member of staff falls ill or is away from school for a short or extended period of time, how easily would somebody coming into the school from, say, an external agency covering be able to hit the ground running with the scheme of work? This should be a really key consideration. And then secondly, consider creating a student-friendly version of your scheme of work. This might be similar to the sort of overview that you provide parents and guardians with, perhaps on a school website with a sort of breakdown of topics by term for each subject over a period of years. Here in my own context, and it's helped by the fact that we use a virtual learning environment where this sort of thing can be easily posted and uploaded. You might have something similar. We essentially provide students with our full scheme of work, minus the teacher notes, minus the assessment information and the sort of SEND and EAL differentiators, but including links to things like the Quizlet list that we use, online grammar tasks for revision and practice, etc., that we use throughout the course. This ticks, on the one hand, a massive SEN box for students who like to jump in and pre-familiarize themselves with topics. But I know for a fact that a lot of our students actually really like to get ahead. They like to see what's coming up next. Some of the brightest and best even jump in and start learning some of the vocab in advance, or thinking about how they might incorporate some of that into what they subsequently do in units. And in the best case scenario, even dipping into things like grammar points or cultural units to come. And that can be really satisfying for them and for you as a teacher as well. Next little slide, please. Just the last sort of element on curriculum design. The last thing I think to think about in this context is how assessments and exams, internal and public, should be factored in. I'm going to give a little bit more time to this later on, but I think it's important to say a couple of key things now, especially about internal assessments, from vocab tests, perhaps weekly vocab tests, right through to full sort of exam hall, end of year style exams. It's really important, and I'll probably find myself saying this again later, it's really important that assessment doesn't become the sort of be-all and end-all, especially in a subject like ours where there's so much more to it than exams. I know that sounds slightly strange coming from an examiner, but it's true. I can't emphasize it strongly enough. Nonetheless, we're not being naive about this either. We know that the anxiety and pressure of assessments weigh heavy on teachers and students alike. We know that the pressure to perform for you and for them is significant. And I want to acknowledge that here today too throughout this discussion. I also think there's a real problem if exams or assessments become divorced from the reality of the day-to-day classroom experience, i.e. if the sort of tasks that students are asked to complete in tests or exams bear no relation to the sort of skills they've been practicing in class. Now, I want to be really emphatic about this. That does not mean, as it were, teaching to the test, but it does mean upskilling students in the course of their day-to-day learning so that they feel equipped and empowered to deal with what the exam requires of them. They should never fundamentally encounter something in an exam that they have not had the chance to practice before. That can be an area of some considerable anxiety in modern languages because, of course, fundamentally all of our receptive texts are unseen, but the tone and register and content of them is similar year on year. Equally, having said that they should never come up with something in an exam that they haven't had a chance to practice, at the same time, nothing in class should ever be done with the sole and express purpose of genuflecting to the exam. So there's an interesting sort of dynamic to think about there, I think. It's easy to semanticize exams or assessments as something that have to take up a long time. Sometimes interminable it can seem. Whole lesson sequences of preparation, and then the big moment itself, and then endless feedback and target setting and filling in forms and you know, rewriting or redrafting parts of essays and then getting those looked over again, etc. All good and useful techniques, but it can seem really time consuming, can't it? Not to mention the fact that with so many different components, 4 key skills and other related skills like translation, listening CDs, oral cards, etc., individual assessment, group assessment, it can be a real chore to administer language exams. Another moment where another occasion where I'm really jealous of colleagues of mine who teach subjects that seem administratively, logistically less complex and demanding. There is obviously time and space for large-scale practice. But don't forget the importance too of ongoing assessment, including in class, so vocab and grammar tests, as well as scaffolded assessment. So, for example, time-structured writings that can give a window into progress and don't have to take hours and hours to complete. Exams should also be appropriately spaced so they don't become oppressive for you or for the students. And we'll talk a little bit later about how we might attempt to juggle all the different components of the CE exam and what might be best to assess at what point. I know we've had questions in the past about when, for example, particular exercise types need to be or should be introduced. When's the best moment, for example, to introduce the teaching of the text-based task? When's the best moment to get students to encounter sort of long writing tasks for the first time, and we will address those points shortly. But equally, if there's anything that comes out of that, do post some questions in the chat, and we can probably make that something of a discussion at the end too. Now, one last, if we could just jump forward one slide, please. One last aspect of curriculum design that I think we should probably think about, and looking specifically at the transition, between Year 7 and Year 8. A question we get asked an awful lot, and we ask ourselves it as well as examiners and as teachers, just to reassure you, is what progress should be seen during, and then perhaps importantly between Year 7 and Year 8. Fundamentally, as we know, for all sorts of reasons, these are 2 crucial and fertile years, and your students are growing up a huge amount as human beings in this time, let alone as learners or even linguists specifically. I think the first thing that came to my mind planning this is that you should certainly see your students becoming more confident. Now, that isn't synonymous with them being louder or more talkative in class, though they might well be. It's something I've certainly seen myself often at this stage. But they should become more able and skillful learners and users of language. In part, it's because by this stage, they've been exposed to it for longer than they ever have been before. Every lesson they go to, every prep that they complete, every speaking practice they do, they are adding to their bank of linguistic tools. They're adding to their points of reference that they have in languages. And so there's a sort of cumulative effect. They should also become more able and skillful or more open, really, to taking risks with or being creative with language. In receptive terms, we hope that during this period they won't be phased, or they may be less phased by longer or more complex texts, including those that require them to use a degree of inference. They might also demonstrate increased autonomy as learners of language as well. And this could take a number of forms. I think it's quite important perhaps at this stage where you can start to really talk about the process of actually learning with your learners. I think it's really important that that becomes a discussion that you have in class. It struck me that actually we in this subject give a lot of feedback, and feedback takes a lot of time because we're looking often at we're working on a single word level. And I'm sure you've been as frustrated as I have when you've given, vocab for students to learn, and they come back and they get 3 out of 10. And you think, for goodness sake, how hard can it be? Have conversations with them about what the best ways to approach vocab learning, structured writing, oral spontaneity are. Make those discussions that you have in your class. I observed a really wonderful lesson by one of my colleagues recently, where they spent a good sort of 15, 20 minutes in a lesson actually having this discussion, putting it into practice with some games and some examples. And I think the students really genuinely got a lot out of it. They were encouraged, for example, to create their own Quizlet lists or knowledge organizers or mind maps rather than just have them presented to them. We know, and research tells us too, that the more different ways in which you encounter a word or an idea, the more likely it is to stick, particularly if you work with and manipulate the knowledge rather than just read it or receive it, i.e., Quizlet, which is something I use quite a lot, although obviously there are lots of other equally useful platforms available. It gives you the opportunity to listen to spell, to play games with, and so on, the words that you have on a vocab list. You can even color code lists, and you can add, pictures to them. You can hear the words spoken. It's a really good sort of multi-sensory tool. But getting them to create their own lists, develop their own repertoires, of perhaps higher tier or familiar or useful constructions that you think they're going to be using in their exams, and they will ideally, as I've said, in class with their teacher, have the opportunity to consciously reflect on aspects of language learning, as we've just been talking about. Strategies, for example, for vocab acquisition and retention, development of dictionary skills, for example, particularly relevant for the speaking exam. Even things like working with cognates or with simple translations can be real fun, and can take some of the burden or pressure off the students as they approach what can seem like unseen or sometimes impenetrable tasks. At this stage too, between or in and between and as they move into year 8, between year 7 and 8, and as they move into year 8, hopefully they'll start to become sensitive to and perhaps start to replicate in productive tasks things like tone and cultural register. Now, we're not talking about anything complicated there. In French, for example, that might be something as simple as differentiating, distinguishing between tu and vous when they're speaking in different registers in oral cards and role plays, and so on. Perhaps use of exclamations or emotive language to emphasize or highlight particular points, for example. In short, in this last year of their hopefully illustrious prep school careers, learners should start to make the move to becoming, I've put it in inverted commas on my page here, independent learners of language. To use an analogy that I know some people have found helpful in the past, they stop, as it were, painting by numbers, and they start to create their own pictures. Now, initially, they won't always be as neat. but they will be driven by the student's own curiosities and communicative needs. And I think that's a really important cognitive step for them at this stage. Now, of course, in order to do this, we're going to jump forward, and we need to talk about how we teach and how we embed and how we consolidate particular skills. This was a major component of one of our previous CPD sessions, where practical tips were offered for each of the main skills we assess. And I think I don't think I have contact with the control room, as it were, at the moment. Julia might be able to tell us at the end. I think you were able to access that, at least perhaps the slides from it online. I'm not sure quite how that works, but if you were there last time, you might recall that we spent a long time talking specifically about vocab and grammar and receptive skills and productive skills. But I think it's just worth touching briefly on here too, especially as we've just been talking about through the lens of curriculum design. In languages, in short, embedding skills is a really long game, and you and your students have to be prepared for that. There is no rehearsed knowledge in this subject, or rather there's very little rehearsed knowledge in this subject. No dates to remember, no formulae to revise, which makes it both easier and harder than others. The bad news, in inverted commas, the bad news for you as teachers and for students, no A4 cheat sheets with a handy timeline or an easy diagram as a one-stop revision shop. But the good news, if the exams are doing their job, they should be testing what the students know, not just what they've managed to memorize or cram. Now, there's no quick and single golden bullet for making a child good at reading or writing or listening or speaking, but a spiral curriculum, as alluded to before, particularly involving frequent re-encountering of material and the use of manipulation of familiar material across unfamiliar territory, can be really helpful. The more exposure, increasingly less scaffolded, the better. It's also really crucial not to treat individual skills as distinct from one another. So if, for example, a student is good at producing simple written sentences that include two tenses and an opinion, they should be able to transfer this to their speaking, and they should be encouraged to do so. One of my colleagues, in the context of GCSE, although fundamentally it's similar, and for many years here and to great success, spends almost the whole of the term essentially preceding the GCSE oral exam, getting the students to write oral questions and practice them out loud. And he says that if they're doing that properly, they are also adding massively to their essay writing bank, which indeed, looking at their results, seems to be a really positive benefit of this. But also if they're being creative with their use of language, trying to seek out interesting ideas, trying to look up unusual vocab at a higher level than we'd expect, obviously, at this stage than at Common Entrance, but nonetheless, the parallels are important. He says it also really helps their reading and listening skills too, because they encounter a broad range of vocab. So I think an important tip that comes out of this perhaps today is to consider which skills depend on each other, and reflect on what might be considered a kind of hierarchy of skills, what I've called here a hierarchy of skills. For example, there's no point trying to tackle a listening multiple choice question from an exam paper, for example, particularly one from the end, towards the end of a listening paper, if practice on things like absolutes or distractors hasn't been completed in advance, because as we know, those are two kind of really important things that come up in receptive exams, in reading listening exams. So consider offering your students a range of exercises to rehearse, practice, consolidate those things before exposing them to a more or to an exam style task, to a more complex and perhaps nerve-wracking real exam paper. It's likely, of course, also that more technical features of skills will be covered near the end of a course rather than at the start. So it's likely that front-loaded introductions to, immersion in, and then practice of grammar, vocabulary, and skills leads to technical practice subsequently in the course. Do revisit the second Twilight CPD session from earlier this year for a more in-depth discussion of each of the different skills, along too with some practical teaching tips for each of them. And so where does all of this lead? Let's jump forward one more slide, please. Where does all of this lead? Well, hopefully for culturally interesting and linguistically rich holidays in France and Germany and Spain and so on, perhaps careers in multilingual organizations in due course and so on. But in the short term, of course, it leads to the exam. And I make the sort of comment that I have because actually, of course, the exam should never be the be all and end all. But I'm under no illusions as to the significance of this experience for you and for your students as well. Nonetheless, there are ways of approaching these things, and we'd like to encourage you and your students to see the exam as the following. Firstly, as an opportunity for them to show off what they know. Now, I used to love exams. I was quite good at them. Perhaps that's why I now write them, to inflict that joy on other people. And I sort of almost used to consider them a sort of a puzzle, a bit like doing a Sudoku. You know the drill, you know there's an answer, you just need to apply what you know to get there. And there's almost a security and comfort in the knowledge that a particular issue can be resolved. In our subject, particularly in the productive components, there's a real freedom to assessment, which I know sounds sort of slightly counterintuitive. But I always tell my students, whatever age, that this is one exam that they are absolutely in control of. I'm talking about the sort of writing and perhaps the speaking elements, because they decide what to say or what to write. And if there's something that they don't know how to say, they can choose to say something else. If there's a verb or an adjective that they're unsure of, they can go back to the starting point and they can try again. More nerve-wracking, admittedly, in the speaking, but in the writing, they do have time to draft, to revisit, to revise, to select the language that they want to use. And language exams really reward creativity and hard work on the part of the student, and in particular, their own development of a repertoire of language that they can deploy in productive tasks. I always really enjoy working on these with my students, and when they play the game, as it were, they can have a lot of fun developing their own portfolio, or as I've sometimes seen it referred to, a suitcase of high-quality language and expressions. Now, at the most basic level, I don't want you to think we're being over-ambitious here. At the most basic level, this might be an interesting adjective, an alternative to something more prosaic that they can try and get in at an appropriate moment. At the highest level, we know that lots of you, and it's great to see if you feel you can do this with your students, we know that lots of you love working with proverbs or idioms or even more complex tenses. The important thing is that these things aren't gratuitous, though. We really want the students to understand how these things work, because if they understand how they work, they also get the most pleasure out of using them. It's also really important that the exam represents the culmination of their learning up to this point. Inevitably, and we're not being naive about this, in language exams, there will be unseens, as I was sort of saying before, unseen texts, unseen prompts on the most basic level. And yes, there will also be verbs, adjectives, phrases that they won't yet have met. Now, that doesn't mean that they've failed to meet some kind of imaginary target. In fact, just as they would in real life, they have to fill in the gaps, or they have to use logic or context or cognates to create meaning out of uncertainty. So this is a really important skill, and it's something that we are actively trying to embed, an ability to deploy that skill. We take our responsibilities here actually really seriously, and we do think really carefully about how these exams can come to represent age and stage appropriate assessments that reflect our candidates' experiences and are pitched at their level and encourage the introduction and practice of positive learning habits within and with broader and transferable skills. And finally, we do want these to be exams that students come out smiling from. Whether that was their experience a couple of weeks ago or not, I'm not sure. Not necessarily because they've got everything right, but because they've faced a challenge head on and they've been able to perform to their best, to the best of their ability. It's easy to forget that exams are also a chance for students themselves, as well as their teachers, to reflect on their own progress. And the common entrance, intimately linked as it is to their senior school transition experience and not swallowed into anonymity like, for example, GCSE and A-level papers are, is a sort of Janus-like moment where they can look back on what they've achieved up till that point and forward to what they hope to achieve next. We know that focus in year 8 turns to exams, but please try to make sure that this isn't a reductive or oppressive process for you or for the students. There's nothing worse than a post-exam anticlimax. I'm seeing a lot of it in my school at the moment, where year 11 and year 13 students are reaching the end of their exam periods, and they sort of think, gosh, this is what it was all about. And it came down to an hour-long paper, and 90% of what I revised didn't even come up. And it's that anticlimax is particularly acute if students feel that they haven't really got anything out of the process other than the exact measured knowledge and clip skills that they need to simply jump through the next hoop. Okay, just we'll probably have another 5 minutes or so, and then we'll open the floor to some questions. A couple of more sort of prosaic things just to finish off with, talking about exam preparation and then enrichment and extension 2. I thought I'd just include something briefly at the end on that. Could we jump forward to the next slide, please? We're not hearing that as much as we used to, are we? Next slide, please. Fantastic. Good. Exam-specific tasks. Great. It is, and I'm sure this will come up in the questions that you have. It looks like in the chat it might already be there, and it will be a subject, I'm sure, of the discussion we have shortly. It is very difficult to write language exams, full stop. It's particularly difficult when, like me, you do it for an audience that you don't know, i.e., all of your students are not students that I teach, but equally it's very difficult to accommodate for the vast range of levels that we know are present amongst students who are 12, 13 years old who are sitting these exams, particularly as I was saying before, amplified by the fact that we know there is everything from native speaking students effectively who sit these exams right through to people perhaps who've only been learning, who've only had, say, an hour a week for a year or two. And we really do, we are aware of that, and we really do try and cater for those different levels. But it's a very difficult thing to do, to write these exams. And we always try and ensure that the ways that our candidates encounter or have to produce language in assessment contexts reflects as closely as possible what are likely to be real life encounters with the language. Hence, for example, the introduction of a text-based task in the speaking component recently, which I think, as I've described it before, is a kind of the aim is to introduce an element of controlled spontaneity. Oxymoronic, I know, but it is the case. I was reflecting on this actually, funnily enough, when I was in Paris quite recently, as a professional linguist, as a teacher of languages. There's an extent to which you can rehearse or practice for a particular situation, and there are still things that will blindside you completely, whatever level you're at, in whatever context you're in, whatever you're saying. I think, therefore, we have to acknowledge that in what we expect our students to do, and in the way that we write these papers. But we hope that our exams are written in a way that fundamentally reflects how students will or would use language in everyday life, in communicative context with their peers, with their friends, with their teachers, for example. Although we know that, particularly, for example, in productive contexts at this stage, that can be a little bit artificial. So that students feel as confident as they can approaching these things, it's really important that, and I've phrased it like this on the screen that you can see in front of you now, it's really important that students are what I called here skills confident, before they are exam confident. And that really goes back to the point that I was just making before. Obviously, you need to prepare your students to sit the exams that we set, but it goes back to this not being the be-all and end-all idea. I remember a senior colleague saying to me when I was on my own sort of teacher training, he said, well, if they can speak French well, they can cope with whatever the exam throws at them. And I'm aware that there are limits to that. But I think fundamentally the principle there is really important. If your students can or are in the positive and proactive habit of producing clear, simple, and accurate language with, say, a couple of tenses, then they should be able to tackle the writing papers that we produce relatively straightforwardly. If they have a wide vocabulary base, and if they have been used to practicing filling in the gap with logical conclusions, if they have a good awareness and of things like cognates and so on, then they should find that they are able to tackle aspects of the listening and reading papers relatively successfully. And so when exam exercises are introduced, it's important that they shouldn't be at odds with students' experience up to that point. Creating continuity between what you do in the classroom and the way in which things are approached in an exam is really, really important. It should be the case that the way in which you teach and encourage the embedding of sort of skills that you might come across in different contexts for different components of the exam reflect how those are ultimately examined. And that isn't teaching to the test, because actually fundamentally the test is supposed to represent what a good speaker of French or German or Spanish should be able to do at that stage. And what I've just put at the end of that slide there is also really important. You need this because it comes up in the exam, is only superficially motivating. It can make students' ears prick up because they think, okay, fantastic, this is worth noting. But ultimately, if it then subsequently doesn't come up in the exam, or if it doesn't come up in the exam in the way that they're expecting it to, for example, then actually that can be something that can really sort of demotivate them. Help them to see that there is a reason and a context for what they are doing beyond an exam paper. And in our subject, in a sense, that couldn't be easier, because this is a skill that they are requiring, yes, to pass an exam, yes, to move on to their senior schools, but also for their lives, hopefully well beyond that too. There are nonetheless, we think, just jumping forward one slide, please, almost at the end, there are nonetheless some specifics that do require, obviously, explicit attention and intervention. And I've just, hopefully this list that you can see on the screen there more or less speaks for itself now. Students will need to practice, and we think that year 8 is sort of the right time to, we think it's an appropriate moment to cover these sort of skills that we're talking about here. They do need to cover things like writing to a specific brief, dealing with interpreting and brainstorming, for example, the bullet points that they get in the writing task. Writing to a word count is a really important thing as well. Writing, as I often say to the students I teach, economically. That's to say, using the best words as far as possible in the best order to create the maximum impact, and not just thinking, well, listen, the word count doesn't matter, I can write as much as I want, which might lead to them going off topic or perpetuating mistakes. Manipulation of grammar, and particularly familiarizing students with the format of that task, i.e. what is the information that they are actually given, and with the sort of base forms of the nouns, with the genders, the base form of key verbs, for example, helping them to understand what that entails is obviously important. There are some sort of technical specificities of the role play and the text-based task in the speaking that obviously they need to be aware of too, not least the marks available for the aspects of spontaneity that we want to introduce there, which could, as I've said in previous sessions, be as simple as something like a brief exclamation or interjection, a supplementary piece of detail provided, and so on. Developing an ability to deal with inference is always quite a controversial thing at this level, because of course it's firstly needed for harder reading and occasionally listening tasks, but this is where we sort of obviously as examiners start to go a little bit off the beaten track, and this is where we can get accused sometimes of sort of using vocab that we think, well, how are students expected to encounter this, or what do you expect them to do with this? By inference, we obviously mean that students have to dig around a little bit for the answer, that it won't be as simple as recognizing and translating a particular word. A piece of information won't be given to them directly, like on the beach today, it's hot. What's the weather on the beach? It's hot. But the information will be obviously a little bit more implied. And there were some examples of the sort of thing that I mean from the CPD that was delivered about the one that we did a year ago. Developing that ability at this stage is really important too, and actually very simple, often very simple literary texts, and don't be alarmed by that, but you know, really simple stories can often be quite good for doing that. Things like where characters' emotions are described, and students have to work out how they might be feeling, for example, from the way that they, from the gestures that they make. Or from the way that they react to a situation. Somebody stomping their feet, for example, is likely to be angry. Somebody who crosses their arms and slams their door, likewise. And that's the sort of skill that we're trying to test a little bit here. Recognizing absolutes and distractors, as sort of mentioned in the context of another point earlier, in receptive tasks is also something to spend a little bit of time on. And then more generally, familiarity with rubrics, including in simpler and more explicit receptive tasks. So in multiple choice questions, in gap fill questions, in reading, we like to try and diversify the way in which those skills are tested. And it's important, obviously, that students feel that those exercises can be accessed. It's always the case that there is an example for each question, and that they should look at that carefully to orientate themselves in the exercise. Really briefly, just to finish off, one final thing on past papers and assessment resources, and then quickly on extension and enrichment. So just jumping forward to, I think, the penultimate slide. Please use past papers and authentic assessment resources with care. There's obviously a limited supply of these fundamentally, and you want to maximize their potential for practice. Equally, we hope, if you wanted to, that things like the role play tasks, the text-based tasks in the speaking, and perhaps the writing and grammar tasks are relatively easy for you to produce further examples of, should you want to use them, say, for an internal exam or for an end-of-year assessment. Reading and listening, and we have this problem too when we teach GCSE and A-level, we know it's a very onerous task to create lots of extra, examples of those that are homemade, as it were. But do use these sparingly and think carefully about where you want to use them in the course, at what points in the course you want to use them. I will reiterate a point that I sort of made implicitly earlier. There is little point in exposing pupils to exercises that they're unfamiliar with. It breeds sort of resentment and real discontentment. They really need to know how to do something before they are faced with it in a formal exam context. It needs to be taught, it needs to be explained, it needs to be practiced, and consider perhaps even walking through either full papers or parts of papers in class before moving to full timed mock exams too. And that includes things like brainstorming bullet points in a writing task, for example, pre-listening or pre-reading, having a look at the questions on a particular text, or the images or the headings or the headlines before actually even reading the original text itself, and seeing what can be inferred, what is implied by those clues, and giving some thought to what the answers to those questions might be. And avoid too death, what I've called here death by past paper, in the latter stages of your scheme of work as well. It's dawned on me increasingly, working as I do a lot with A-level and GCSE students, and doing lots of past paper work with them, which is really necessary in our subject. It's authentic practice, it's good, it's important. But these are things that can be done often very successfully by the students on their own, particularly reading and listening tasks. In fact, it's the perfect independent task, setting students off with some reading, with some listening, getting them to go through it, getting them to correct their own answers, listen back to the CD again, look through the transcript carefully, mark out words that they didn't know, perhaps create Quizlet lists with new ideas, etc. Obviously, we know that writing and speaking particularly require more intervention and often assessment from the teacher. But actually avoid, as far as possible, situations where at the end of your course you're spending the last 2 or 3 months just churning through past papers in class. Keep the students on their toes, keep them interacting with each other, and there are lots of things that you can do that represent or reflect real exam tasks, but that don't have to be presented as such. I did something, for example, preparing for my year 9 end of year exam with my class this morning, which essentially represented essay bullet points that they'll have to write on. But we did them as a kind of randomized thing, and they had individual words or short phrases, and they had to do some sort of speed writing. So they flashed up on the screen. There was an element of kind of jeopardy and randomness to it, which I think they found fun. It was quite ludic. And then they had to do a sort of brainstorm and come up with the best ideas. And what they didn't realize is that essentially they were writing a number of mini essays. But it was probably better and more useful for them than if I'd just given them a past paper to get on with and collected it in and not given it back to them until later this week. They got some immediate feedback and some immediate response. Lastly, and I promise I will only be another couple of minutes, thinking really quickly about extension and enrichment. Here we go. Yeah, perfect. Up on the screen there. Fundamentally, year 8 for you is when you will see your linguists at their very best and when they will exhibit their greatest potential that you've ever known them to have. And therefore, whilst the exam weighs heavily on the horizon at this point in the program and for them, it's also a wonderful opportunity to exploit that ability and interest and curiosity and, of course, maturity that they have at this stage too. Entrance exams for lots of schools will require knowledge and understanding of language that's much higher than common entrance, particularly if you've got students that are opting for scholarship papers involved in writing and assessing those too. And sometimes the levels can be very, very different. But nonetheless, this remains a really good opportunity to engage in cultural enrichment. And don't please see this as being in conflict with exam preparation, not to sort of labour the point too much. But obviously, fundamentally, if they are interacting with language, if they are reading, if they are speaking, if they are listening, then they are adding to their toolkit of language that they have encountered. And it might come up it might be language that they can draw on in an exam context. So just to finish off, this is the last slide, just some potential projects to think about possibly here. Please do get in touch with us if you'd like some more detail or information about specific resources we might recommend. But things like brief introductions to literature, film, short film, especially effective if themed. Something I really like doing is using just really short clips from films where there is a specific topic or theme or even grammar point that I'm trying to work on. Songs are great for this as well. A quick Google search, if you type in, something like, chanson en français plus a particular tense, you'll get, some really good examples there come up straight away. A little clip from something like Le Petit Nicolas, where he's interacting with his family, for example, might be a really nice starter for talking about family relationships, identifying people on the screen, how might they get on with each other, just to give you a sort of an example off the top of my head there. Competitions too, increasingly, even universities, often senior schools, perhaps sometimes external organizations too, are offering things like translation, composition competitions, which could be of interest. Celebrating, as I'm sure many of you do, things like World Languages Day or specific cultural celebrations in particular countries. I put their primary language projects. And what I mean by that is a sort of mentoring scheme whereby perhaps some of your older students might coach or help your younger learners practice their languages. We had a lovely scheme like that ran in a school where I taught, where some of the year 8 students would give of their lunch times and break times on a sort of rotational basis, and they would help with some of the year 4 and 5, actually, as it was then, classes, which happened because the break times and lunch times were at slightly different points of the day. So they would actually go in and they do some singing with them or some chanting or some flashcards or whatever it might be. So consider how you can use your model year 8 students as a resource. And of course, anything that they do there, even if it seems relatively simple, will be reinforcing their own knowledge and understanding as well. Online exchanges, increasingly prevalent, and perhaps a hand slightly forced by COVID. Students in different countries, different cultures interacting with each other through letters, Skyping or Teamsing or Zooming into classes, that sort of thing can be quite fun. Trips and visits too, which don't actually always have to be international. We're very lucky being down here half an hour from London. And sometimes we are able to take students up to see particular films or galleries. Consider cross-curricular opportunities here too. It might be that an art trip, for example, or a drama trip that one of your colleagues is running has ramifications for potential exploration from a languages point of view as well. Our own IPQ, which our sort of project qualification, can be accessed from a languages base as well, from a languages perspective. And lastly, and I'd say this as a senior school head of faculty, I love it when I'm able to either go into or welcome our feeder schools here in our own environment. I'm always looking for potential collabs, whether that's master classes, scholarship classes, whether it's a French cafe, whether it's something like that primary language project that I was talking about, but where our students go and help teach them, for example, that can be really worthwhile and productive too. So do get in touch where you have obvious destination senior schools and see what they might be able to offer you as well. There's some, hopefully there's some ideas that you think might apply to your own school or to your own situation. I think we're going to jump out there and come to some questions, conscious of the time, conscious also that there'll be lots of questions. So I think Julia is probably there somewhere lurking behind the PowerPoint. There we are. Fantastic, Julia. Far away.
Absolutely lurking. Well, that was brilliant. Well, we do have loads of questions. So what I would like to do is I'm just going to start with a couple that were sent in ahead of time because people had graciously sent those in when they registered. Is there a chance we could have a more concise list of vocabulary that might come up for our slightly weaker candidates, has been asked?
I think we talked about vocab in our the first CPD session that we did back last year, and the point was made that we deliberately, and I could totally understand how, in a sense, frustratingly, don't essentially publish a kind of minimum core vocabulary list for languages. There are a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, we don't want your students' experience of the subject to be limited to the words that we select. We want you to have the freedom, and we're aware that we cater for schools from different countries, different cultural contexts. We don't want your own experience to be sort of prescribed by a list like that we might produce. Equally, we hope that the sort of topic headings that we provide, whether it's something like transport, town, food and drink, sort of are sufficiently illuminating and sufficiently specific so as to allow you to perhaps, we were talking about collaborative schemes of work earlier, to perhaps collaborate as a department maybe, and think to yourselves, right, what are the likely things that our students are going to need to know here? What are the high frequency words or expressions or ideas that they're likely to be, that they're going to likely, in all likelihood, need to know to be able to tackle essays or even receptive tasks on those topics. So my understanding at the moment is that we're standing firm on kind of saying that actually we don't want to limit fundamentally what is a broad and potentially very expansive specification to a list of 500 words or 1,000 words. Another great source, of course, of sort of information to get into our minds as examiners and setters is to look at the sort of things that we set in our own papers as well, not just recently for the recent spec, because fundamentally the topics really haven't changed, but take as a guide the sort of things that we set, the kind of vocab that comes up in the papers that we produce, and see, take that as an indication of register, of level, of tone, of variety as well.
Great, thank you very much. Now I have another one, last one that was sent beforehand, and then we'll go into the chat, don't worry. How can we help students with part 2 of the speaking with the flashcards if they don't know specific words that will be used?
This is referring to the text-based task of the speaking exam.
I believe so. The question said, how can we help students with part 2 of the speaking with the flashcards?
Yeah, okay, I've just got confirmation as well. Okay, so yeah, great. So as I was saying before, we're really excited about the introduction of this part. We're probably more excited than you are about it. The introduction of this text-based task, because we think, as I was saying earlier, it introduces this sense of controlled spontaneity, i.e. there is stuff that the students can prepare in advance, but they also obviously don't know which questions they're going to be asked specifically, and how it is that they're going to be phrased, or even perhaps in what order they might come up. Obviously, in preparation for the speaking part of the exam, they have access to dictionaries that they can use to anticipate, parts of topic vocab that they might need to use. And we suggest looking at the headers that they have, looking at the descriptions that they're given, looking at the range of vocab that appears on the stimulus card. And part of embedding skills, as we were saying earlier, includes things like working with dictionaries to help embed those sort of skills. Ultimately, they are not going to, and nor do we when we speak to each other in other languages, we can't guess or anticipate every single thing that they might ask, or every single way in which that could be phrased. And I think a really important thing to do here is to get your students used to how familiar structures within language work. Getting them to do things like recognizing particular question words. For example, they don't need to understand every word in a question in the way that it's phrased by the examiner to understand, for example, that they're being asked to give a time, or they're being asked to give a physical description of something, or say where something is, just to sort of give an example that might be relevant to this task. So I think the answer is plenty of practice. I think it probably starts with some sample kind of texts, although really they're grids of information fundamentally around specific topics like holidays, or descriptions of somebody, or descriptions of a school. It probably starts with a dictionary and saying, right, what are the words that we already know? What are the words that we're going to need to look up here to be able to probably interact in the way that we'd like to? And then it's going to be, I think it's going to involve lots of listing out for particular question words, listing out for particular prompts, so that the students that are being examined, can sort of navigate their way to an answer, if that makes sense. In the listening, in the reading, and in the speaking. And it's something I'd really like to emphasize. They do not ever need to understand every single word in order to come up with a notion of an answer that they can be happy with.
Thanks, Will. That's super thorough. Thank you. So we are going to the chat now. Mrs. Marshall had said CE this year was streamlined due to COVID. We're finding that the knock-on effect is that younger years coming up are a good half term or even term behind where we would have normally been. Can you acknowledge this, or are you going to acknowledge this in upcoming examinations? November 21 was really rather tricky given loss of learning time.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is that we really sympathize with that. I mean, we are all, those of us who set these papers are all or have been teachers, and we know, even sometimes, forget COVID for a second, even how other factors can disrupt learning, or with a particularly difficult class, or with a particularly weak class, for example, or periods of disrupted learning, transitions between teachers and so on, how easy it is to fall behind and feel like you're constantly kind of scrabbling to make up time or make up content. We also know and are seeing every day in our own classrooms the effect that loss of time to COVID, particularly, and the move to online learning, and perhaps disrupted online learning for lots of schools, has had. And in a sense, one of the answers to that is kind of what we've been talking about here, which is thinking about how the skills that we embed support the delivery and the understanding of that content. I'm not, please don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to sort of dismiss that concern entirely. It's a perfectly legitimate one. But equally, we hope that if students practice things like reading well, listening well, speaking well, producing coherent texts, then even if they've had perhaps slightly less time than usual to do it, as in to actually encounter different topics, encounter as wide a base of vocab and key ideas as they might have done in the past. We hope that in a sense their familiarity with good techniques to help them encounter those tasks will help to at least make up some of that difference. I think one of the things that is always really obvious to us when we set and when we examine these papers ourselves in our own jobs is that actually the skills, in a sense, are much more important than the specificities of the particular content. That's to say, it's very unlikely that, it's not impossible, but it's very unlikely that you're going to have a student who can write an incredible, you know, A-star, perfect 150-word essay on their town, but not be able to make any coherent sense when the topic is something like my school. Even a cursory, you know, kind of awareness of that topic, some of the key vocab, some of the key notions that they need, should be enough to at least allow them to access that. And fundamentally, if they're aware of the skills that they need to encounter and embrace those topics, i.e. if they know that this is what a template sentence that includes 2 key tenses, for example, looks like, if they know that they have to give an opinion, if they know that ideally they should be using some sequencing language, most of which of course are not topic specific anyway, in this example that I'm talking about in productive tasks, then actually they have quite a lot of, you know, stuff there, quite a lot of material that they can already start to work with, quite a lot of bricks. And it's the cement, I suppose, in this sort of metaphor that is perhaps taking that joins it all together, that perhaps is the thing that's most threatened by the disruption that we've seen recently, because it needs time to be practiced and consolidated, and it needs time to set and to make those, you know, structures, to maximize the potential that those individual structures and notions have. I think it's probably also worth just emphasizing that your senior schools or the people marking these papers know this as well. I think that is, I cannot overstate that. And what that looks like in, you know, in particular schools, in particular contexts, obviously I can't speak for everyone, but we are acutely aware and sympathetic to, as senior school teachers, that disruption that you faced. And we in turn are hoping that our GCSE examiners and A-level examiners will be too. So in a sense, the burden of acknowledgement on that is partly us in the way that we set and devise these papers, but it's also on the way that they're assessed in a more sort of holistic way that takes into account your individual candidates' progress in their own context.
Lovely, thank you. I've had a question here. How many hours of language teaching per week are you assuming pupils in a typical prep school are receiving?
That's a really interesting question. I saw that flash up during the talk. We know that there is a whole variety of experiences that our prep schools bring to these exams. The answer is that I don't think, technically speaking, we assume any particular amount. We obviously assume some teaching, but I don't think, for example, we sit down and say, well, these papers should be achievable for students who've had an hour and 20 minutes worth of teaching every week for X number of weeks. We know, I'm in my head, I'm sort of thinking from a French perspective specifically, but we know, for example, often in the case of Spanish and German, sometimes particularly when they're done as sort of subsidiary languages, that actually those might only even be accessed through clubs or after school activities, or lunchtime clubs, or will sometimes have a, you know, less time allocated to them than French in some schools, not in every school, obviously. So there isn't an assumption of any particular amount of time. And I think I'd be nervous here in this context about sort of saying this is how much you should be affording to your language teaching in schools. I think we are assuming regular structured input. And I think we're probably assuming as well that students have the chance to independently learn outside of the classroom and are encouraged to do so, whether that's, you know, learning vocab, whether it's consolidating grammar, whether it's going away and producing tasks that subsequently get assessed by a teacher. But I think, I mean, even with the schools that, for example, I work with here, just off the top of my head, I think I'm right in saying that I know that we here deal with everything from students who have something like 2 hours and 15, 2.5 hours of French per week, right down to something like schools that have about an hour and 10, an hour and 15, which is obviously a big, you know, difference. And I can also say whether it's reassuring or not, I don't know. It's certainly not advocating, you know, less time and partitioning up the curriculum like that. There is often very little discernible difference between, you know, a student who comes to us at common entrance and has done, you know, has been in a school where they've had 3 40-minute lessons a week versus one that's had 2 35-minute lessons a week. As in, it's, you know, that difference is not immediately noticeable to us. If it is, it's something that actually it's our responsibility fundamentally later on to cater for, as well as we take those students in a more sort of homogenous context on with their learning through to GCSE and beyond.
Lovely. Right. Well, we've got a few more questions, but what I'm going to do is, if we might have to whiz through them, because what I'm worried about is people dropping off and not getting the answers to their questions.
No problem.
But
I'll try and be really quick.
No, it's fine. I think it's amazing, because what's happening is we're getting really fabulous, rich discussion about MFL, which is great. In the last papers, Spanish had a choice of 2 topics for the 5 sentences, but only 1 for French. Why is that? And will this be transferred to the new format? That's from Louise.
That is a really good question. And again, I saw that come from the chat. I'm live here now. I'm going to need to go and just double check that. And in fact, no, sorry. I've just got a little message through saying, I've got someone else here in my ear almost. This is incredible. I've just, yeah, okay, there we go. Yes. So sorry, I've just had confirmation there, because I off the top of my head, I couldn't remember. Yes. So yes, the answer is yes. I'm told that this will be transferred to the new format and that they will have the option of 2 topics in the new papers. Yeah, that's what I've just heard.
There you go. Live
from the voice in my ear or in my head.
Both are equally brilliant. Mrs. H. Marshall says the trouble is, for pupils, it's the be all and end all. They just want to get the grades for entry to their next school. Absolutely understood. I think we're really sympathetic to that. Hopper's Physics, brilliant. So we've got some MFL and some science going on. Nice collab. Unless pupils have knowledge of past, present and future tenses, it's not possible for them to access higher marks in the speaking and writing exams. Excellent use of 2 tenses with good vocab isn't rewarded? Question mark.
Excellent use of 2 tenses with good vocab absolutely is rewarded. It's not that it's not that it's redundant. We do expect at this level that students, even if it's in a very, in fact, almost preferably if it's in a basic, correct, simple way, are able to demonstrate knowledge of 3 key tenses. And certainly in French and Spanish, that might be as simple as, for example, with the near future. So the sort of simple construction of in French, obviously I'm thinking about 3 tenses here. Apologies, 3 tenses specifically for French. That can be as simple as with the near future, where they have obviously their form of aller plus the infinitive. That's where sort of structured practice and scaffolded practice is so important. I guess I'm not sitting here for a second saying, well, you know, of course this should be achievable. It's very, very simple to do. But this is where, you know, we were talking earlier about embedding and practicing skills becomes really, really important. We talked, I think I circulated a resource actually via the sort of team leader for languages a while ago about sort of creating multi-tense sentences of the type that we might expect in really good level 2 scripts. And working with templates of language like that can be really important. So something as simple as normally I X, but last year I Y, and next year I'm going to Z. It is relatively simple for a proficient user of language like the examiners and the teachers here are, but actually it demonstrates real linguistic flexibility and creativity on the part of students. So no, we reward positively everything that's there, but it's important equally that we do differentiate, because otherwise the logical extreme of that argument is, well, okay, if they know the one tense, you know, really, really, really well, and with some really, really, really good vocab, you know, does that count more than use? There has to be, we have to at some point put a sort of expectation of a sense of linguistic and grammatical diversity on there, and that's where we've chosen to sort of draw our line, which I think is really important. Yeah.
Lovely. And there was another one from Hopper's Physics slightly earlier on that just said, in the recent reading and writing exam, the reading texts were more difficult than in previous years. Range of vocab and knowledge of grammar were challenging. Is this going to be the format for the new exam? And both Mrs. Marshall and Naomi McKee agreed.
So I presume this refers to French, or actually I don't think it particularly matters in terms of the way I'm going to answer it. We really try hard, and it's a difficult thing to do because obviously it's even as examiners, it's very difficult to sort of say, well, the children will definitely know that, or that's definitely going to be a challenge for them because, you know, depending on what they've studied, in what way, their background and so on, it depends. We never try and make, you know, a set of papers consciously harder or easier than any other. Equally, we have, I think, over the last few years, certainly since I've been working on the team, been thinking really carefully about how we can, in a sense, not make the papers more challenging. I'm going to be really clear about that, but try and get the students to engage a little bit more with what I'd sort of refer to as kind of linguistic puzzles almost. We want, in a sense, the answers to be sometimes be a little bit less obvious, and have to make them work not only through their understanding and knowledge of vocab, but also through grammar, through cognates, through language families and patterns, work to reach those answers, if that makes sense. And that was a sort of conscious decision that was made a while ago, just to kind of embed a little bit more rigor into the papers in that sense. It's a skill that takes time to practice and takes time to get used to. It's difficult to say whether this is going to be the format, as it were, for the new exam, because I mean, in the sense that yes, you can expect questions that will comprehension questions that will have that will be based on inference, small degrees of inference. Yes, you can also expect, for example, comprehension questions that will rely not on pure vocab recognition, but also, for example, understanding of different tenses, so being able to negotiate, you know, between time frames and understanding when somebody did something, or things like negotiate through negative expressions to see, you know, to decide on outcomes. Yes, that is an element of our current and new exams, and we think that's really important. We think that's training and promoting really good linguistic skills. It does make it less immediately obvious what the answers are, but actually in some cases, but actually it's also really, but you know, we really value that element of not difficulty but challenge.
Lovely. Good one here from Acorn Clayton. Advice on opting for level 1 or level 2 entry for middle or weaker candidates, please. Is a strong level 1 better than a weaker level 2?
This is really a question we get all the time. It's a really important one. I think one thing that I would say immediately is never be afraid to check in with your senior schools about this sort of question, because it might be that depending on, for example, the language courses that they offer in year 9, they might feel they can accommodate for, you know, a range of students. In my school, for example, we would rather all students follow the level 2 course, even if some of them ultimately perform worse in that, because we can then assume a particular coverage and depth and set of skills, if that makes sense. So probably the best thing to do is check in with the senior school or schools that you work closely with. I mean, in sort of real terms, even a very strong level 1, a top performing level 1 student is likely, I mean, I suppose technically, yes, a very strong level 1 student could be better at, say, French than a very weak level 2 student. But there are nuances in terms of the tasks that they're expected to complete, and the depth and range required at level 2 is such that even if those students are not struggling or finding it difficult, but having to meet with additional challenges there, it's all part of that training and that we were sort of talking about earlier, and embracing those challenges is important. So for sort of linguistically rigorous course, you might find, and to get the best in the medium and long term out of your students, you might find that level 2 is more appropriate, even though it presents more of an obvious challenge initially. But that's not, you know, that isn't us being sort of, you know, that's not me being dismissive of the level 1 qualifications at all. The reason that there is a differentiated level that exists is so that a range of candidates and to go back to that question earlier about how much time you have in your schools, so that a range of candidates with a range of experience who studied languages for a range of amount of times in different contexts can be accommodated for. It depends too, I suppose, on how you value outcomes, if that makes sense, you know, and what your senior school wants to see from you ultimately as well.
Lovely. From Victoria Level, all of Year 7 will take Spanish from scratch, despite studying French since reception. I'm certain that this is the correct decision. Any advice for how I explain it to parents?
I take from the sort of the comment that's above that presumably that's in place of French rather than as well as, and assuming that's the case, let me answer it like this. I think that is, so there will be parents who are concerned by that for one reason really, which is, well, for two reasons. They will think, has the French that my child studied up to this point gone to waste? And they might, as in fact, I think, yeah, Victoria, isn't it, has sort of alluded to here, there might be parents who worry about, or who would prefer their students to engage in French to GCSE and beyond rather than Spanish. I think that second consideration is quite a difficult one, and different, different parents, different families will have different opinions on what languages might be best for their child at whatever point. There are obviously, and I'm not going to sort of spend time listing them here, there are advantages to studying French over Spanish, and there are advantages to studying Spanish over French, obviously. And you can look at, population head counts, you can talk about prevalence in different parts of the world. You can, where we're interested is where we talk about things like, at this level, things like pronunciation, things like relationship with English for ease of kind of transition and that sort of thing. I think there will be some parents who you'll never be able to reassure about that, because I think, particularly in this context, they might be surprised by what they see as, the French they learned going to waste. If you're certain it's the correct decision, I think I would probably try and explain or justify that by drawing on your own experience, which you sort of have said that you have, by explaining the advantages of Spanish, and also by explaining how the linguistic relationship between French and Spanish will allow them to access aspects of that language more easily than they would have done if they were coming at it sort of without any knowledge of a foreign language. Because of course there are, fundamental similarities between the two languages. But I can see that that's a very sort of it seems to me that's a very particular situation. It's quite a difficult one to sort of advise probably on here. I think yeah. Just trying to. I'm sorry, my brain is doing overtime here. I think probably one of the other things to think about will be, I'm not sure obviously what your where your students go to senior school, is to look at what options might be available for them there. For example, one of our prep schools that we work with in my school, one of our big feeders who give us, maybe 15-20% of our students every year, they can study French or Spanish. But at our school, you can pick up Spanish ab initio in year 9, but you can't pick up French ab initio. So if parents are really unsure, they might see the value in Spanish, but they might say, well, let's carry on with French for a while. They know that they can pick up Spanish at another point. They know that they're not completely closing the door on Spanish if they don't pick it in year 7. They know that their students can study French in year 7, 8, 9, and also pick up Spanish at another point subsequently. So perhaps, looking at the various optionalities that exist there and highlighting what options might be subsequently available could be a useful step in this situation, I would imagine. But it's difficult without knowing more context, if that makes sense.
Well, listen, thank you so much for today, Will. Loads of hugely valuable content delivered with absolute enthusiasm and professionalism as ever. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us on the chat and asking such brilliant questions, and hopefully you got the answers to everything that you needed there, whether you're on the chat or whether you sent that in beforehand. So all it leaves me to do is say a huge thank you to Will, and I hope that you and your wonderful dash hand can now be released into this wonderful summer's evening.
I will go and let her out. We'll go sit.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Take care.